Welcome to Sidebar, Bracewell's podcast devoted to government enforcement and investigations, corporate compliance, and white-collar criminal defense. I'm Matthew Nielsen.
And I'm Phil Bezanson.
And we are your host, and we are both partners at Bracewell LLP, where we represent companies, boards of directors, and individuals in all manners of litigation, investigation, and enforcement actions. Phil, who's our guest for today?
Thanks, Matthew. Today, we're fortunate to welcome Assaad Nasr. Assaad's a friend of mine who I've known for years. I've also had the opportunity to work with him. Assaad's a deal lawyer and in the past has acted as general counsel of an international real estate development organization. And that's what we're going to focus on today. We're going to talk about the challenges that attorneys in the United States face when they're working on international projects. And part of that, of course, is how that all gets intertwined with things like government enforcement and investigations and compliance, and hopefully not white-collar criminal defense, but maybe that happens sometimes. I've not represented Assaad as a defendant in a white-collar criminal case. So
as of yet.
You can set as of yet. So
I just can't believe we found someone who's willing to publicly say they've been your friend for many years.
We had to dig deep. But we're really happy to have you here today, Assaad. So welcome to Sidebar.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. Long-time listener, first-time Potter. So I'm very excited for this opportunity. Thanks to both of you for allowing me this forum.
Well, great. Thanks. So, Assaad, let's just kind of kick it off with the basics. You get a call. You said you've got a client who has a new international project that they're thinking about, and they're looking at the business side of things and say, all right, to make sure we do this correctly, how do we start? What do we need to figure out so we can go build this thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I've been fortunate to receive those phone calls. And once you get rid of the initial concern, once you hear the jurisdiction that you're potentially going to be operating in, you got to come up with your action plan. And in my mind, I'm someone who has always really tried to not let my ego get the best of me. And what I mean by that is, if I'm operating in a jurisdiction or potentially operating in a jurisdiction in which I don't have any familiarity, my first thought is I have to reach out to my network to try and figure out some good referrals for local counsel. I think you cannot overestimate how critical of a function local counsel can perform in these types of transactions. And obviously, you want to make sure that you're getting competent counsel that can be of assistance, and especially if you're dealing with jurisdictions where perhaps the formalities are not necessarily followed so scrupulously. You got to make sure that the people that you do engage to assist you with that at the local level, will be as above board as you can find. And so, oftentimes my starting point, again, obviously, I'm talking about jurisdictions where, perhaps I personally don't have, prior experience or people in a network that, I've already, consulted with before, et cetera. This is really for the novel, jurisdictions where I would, think about, okay, well, as a first step, who can I reach out to? Who can I talk to try to start to collect names? And I think, this has happened with one of the co-hosts of this very podcast, actually, where, I was going into a new territory, at least a new domain, data privacy. And I needed a good referral for local data privacy counsel that would be familiar with, all the bells and whistles for the regime in the jurisdiction. And Phil was very helpful in that regard. So, I guess really the short answer to your question is I just call Phil and ask if he knows anyone that works in, X jurisdiction. And that usually results in... That's what he was looking for. Right. No, exactly. I'm sorry it took so many...
You finally got to what he was trying to get to.
This is basically... Yeah. Okay, so 10 episodes in and someone has finally said something nice about me. We can retire the podcast now. Right. This is great.
Yeah.
This whole endeavor has been about...
We've gone through a lot of people. We finally found one. Yeah. Fantastic.
All kidding aside, you reach out to people whom you trust to try to leverage their network to try to get you the best context. I mean, I think that that's something that is a critical part of good client service, is not just, thinking that you are the be all and end all of, any legal issue that might come up in every jurisdiction. Of course, we want to think that, we're highly intelligent, we're highly educated, we're being paid, hopefully, a lot of money to solve our clients' problems. But in my mind, that has to be checked by this notion of there are some things that off the bat, you don't know. And you're also often in a position where you don't know what you don't know. And so you want to try to, in order to resolve those conflicts, you want to try and get assistance. And, I don't think that thinking that you would be doing a disservice to your client by, not bringing in other advisors, by trying to, keep all the work, in-house, quote unquote. I don't think that in the end is the best, is serving your client to the best of your abilities. A lot of these situations, the worst possible outcome is to get something wrong, is to, run afoul of the local, authorities, is to, get substantive issues of substantive law incorrect, which could scuttle the entire transaction, or result in your client having unexpected liabilities going forward. So if you can fix that up front by getting the right counsel, local advisors, et cetera, that can help guide you through the process, especially in unfamiliar jurisdictions, that in the end is the best way to serve your clients. So to go back to the question, that's how I start. I think about, okay, if I don't know people myself, who can I ask that is in my network? People that you've learned about, that you went to law school with, that you worked, in your first firm at a law school with, that you've met through conferences and, referrals and friends of friends, et cetera. I mean, these might seem like basic notions, but I think that they can be absolutely critical and helpful in, getting the right help to, deal with issues that might be a first impression for you as a U.S. practitioner.
Sure. And I mean, obviously this is going to change based upon, kind of the jurisdiction and kind of what you're doing overseas. But, since we are kind of focused on more of the, compliance and white collar issues, I mean, from a high level, when you're thinking about doing a transaction or business in a foreign jurisdiction, kind of what are the, let's say, top risk that you're thinking about and thinking that here are the things that I'm going to need to make sure that we understand what the local laws are and what we need to do that may be different than what our expectations are here in the U.S.?
Absolutely. So, obviously Matthew, you raise, critical preliminary matters that you have to tackle. And from my perspective, understanding sort of the applicable regulatory regime that applies, to the target or, whether you're acquiring a company or with respect to a real estate project, for, whoever is going to be regulating whatever, entity or structure you create in connection with the development of that piece of property. That to me is sort of like the threshold matter because, you have to understand who are the regulators that, have jurisdiction for that transaction. Are we talking about sort of competition, regulators that govern anti-competitive behavior, which, you would expect that would be, akin to, our DOJ and FTC, obviously in the United States. Within a specific industry, if you're dealing with real estate, obviously, or whatever it might be, telecommunications, manufacturing, industrials, media and entertainment. There's a lot of media regulators outside of the United States that we don't quite have to the same extent here in the United States, and that one can sometimes surprise some clients. But as a threshold matter, understanding exactly who are the players from sort of the regulatory perspective. What agencies, subdivisions of agencies, et cetera, are germane to your transaction. That has to be the first step because there you get a better understanding of, okay, who specifically am I dealing with, not just in terms of a bureaucracy and in terms of like an agency, but specifically individuals within that agency who are going to be scrutinizing the transaction, who would you need to liaise with in order to, get your deal approved if there are, specific affirmative approvals that need to be provided. So in my mind, that's sort of like the number one issue.
So that's interesting that you mentioned that you're talking about, it's not just agencies, but it's specific people at agencies. It's like figuring out how to identify the right decision maker. But then, the sort of red flag question is, how do you get access to this decision maker? Yeah. And how do you do it in a way where you don't get in more trouble than less trouble?
No, that's a great point. And I didn't mean to suggest, of course, that, there would be necessarily, direct, trying to exert direct influence on those particular individuals. I just meant, and this is, I think, especially true in smaller jurisdictions, obviously, you can often have repeat players in these transactions. So to the extent that you are, especially for those practitioners that are trying to create sort of a niche practice or a specialized practice, even from the US, to the extent that you're dealing with the same jurisdictions and the same types of deals in those jurisdictions, chances are that you're going to be dealing with the same people on a consistent basis. And maybe even if you're not familiar with them from the US perspective, going back to what we were talking about earlier, the local counsel or advisors whoever you've engaged, they're more likely to already have those relationships. And so I think oftentimes I found that they are the ones, your local advisors are the ones who can better inform you as to who those particular individuals might be, what their experiences have been like with those individuals in the past, what are their pressure points in terms of, transaction structures or, particular issues that they are very sensitive to, given the climate in that particular jurisdiction. So that's what I mean. Like, you can start to build a relationship or leverage the relationship that your local advisors have with those individuals. And as I was saying, in the smaller jurisdictions where, the staff at these organizations, agencies tends to be leaner, obviously, that's where you tend to be dealing with, repeat players and the same individuals over and over.
Well, and sometimes you do have those kind of shady characters as well. I mean, I remember we had an investigation in Italy and we were asking somebody about a construction project and they were talking about getting approval from the mayor. Right. And we sat there for a while and eventually the guy looked at us and said, well, he's not really the mayor.
Yes.
Like,
no,
okay.
Look,
got it.
You absolutely have to be sensitive to that, Matthew. I mean, we'd be naive if, we completely skirted the issue. And there are times when, it's whether it's the mayor or someone's brother who just so happens to be, in charge of the department that needs to issue the permit to allow that particular construction to take place. We can be frank. There are jurisdictions where that kind of thing goes on. And, I think people are trying to be more discreet about it in some places. That I don't think that holds true everywhere. But I think that's, again, not to sound like a broken record. I don't know if that's a great analogy to use anymore in these technological days, but, that's right. That's where having people on the ground that have dealt with these kind of situations before, chances are, they know how to maneuver and navigate through those more sticky situations better than you do. Certainly, especially if this is a novel jurisdiction for you as a U.S. practitioner, and you don't really have the experience on the ground. And frankly, the other benefit of that is putting more layers in between you and, what's happening in that jurisdiction, which can certainly be, potentially beneficial from your own perspective as an attorney practicing in the United States, but, without trying to be too facetious, trying to make sure that your client is not being exposed to any kind of shenanigans that could get in trouble, not only with the local regulators, but certainly, of course, with their U.S. regulators. Obviously, you wouldn't want to do anything that could potentially jeopardize that kind of a situation. And of course, were that to be the case, my first phone call would be to Matthew and Phil to try and help out in that kind of a situation. But without trying to take away business from you guys, we're trying to avoid there being any sort of allegations of impropriety or unlawful or unethical conduct. But that kind of stuff does go on, and so you have to try to manage it without putting undue risk on your client, but still trying to facilitate their aims of accomplishing the transaction.
So talking about those layers that you mentioned, I mean, it feels like this is an area where you say, okay, we have at least one local organization that we've hired, but if this is going to be a big project, there are going to be a lot of people involved, and there are going to be a lot of different entities involved doing a lot of different things.
Yep.
We got to keep track of who all these characters are. We got to understand who they are. We got to know what everyone's doing and who's getting paid and how they're getting paid, and make sure they actually get paid an appropriate amount for appropriate work. I mean, is that something that you typically see getting quarterbacked out of the US, or is that something that you sort of US counsel can be involved in to make sure it goes correctly, or is that more turned over to the business side people who are on the ground?
That's a great question. In my experience, look, to be honest, I think it really spans the gamut. In my personal experience, I've often been the person tasked with that very job, Phil, because at least there, the client, who in theory has a very close relationship with the U.S. attorney, in my case, that was the situation. They at least want to know that there's someone who they can count on, who's reliable, who they have a pre-existing relationship with, who at least is overseeing everyone else who's supposed to be, doing their jobs, doing their tasks, whether it's from here or in the local jurisdiction. So, maybe that's not the best from a personal liability perspective, but, it's certainly helpful in terms of having one dedicated resource that is, at least understands who is doing what, and being able to make sure that they are fulfilling their obligations, that they are, to the extent that those other parties with whom you're working are appropriately delegating tasks. I certainly think it is beneficial to have a point person, that has that close relationship with the client, because otherwise, you get to a point. I mean, we've talked a lot so far today about, engaging the assistance of others. You could potentially run into like a law of diminishing returns problem, where there are too many cooks in the kitchen, right? And it becomes too unwieldy. And, you've got managers overseeing managers. And at some point, you're going to get sort of stuck in this morass of internal bureaucracy, which isn't going to be conducive to getting the deal done, especially if there are tight timelines. So, yes, you want to make sure that you have competent people on the ground that have the relationships necessary to facilitate the transaction, but you don't want to add too many levels of complexity and oversight such that it grinds everything down to a halt. So as I said, in my personal situation, I've often been that person. And I find that to be beneficial, frankly, as a practitioner, because it helps me manage that particular deal, which obviously, ultimately you're responsible for vis-a-vis the client. And so you want to make sure that, things are getting done and they're getting done appropriately. Two, it helps you gain some substantive legal knowledge and at least operational knowledge as to how things work in that jurisdiction, so that on a going forward basis, you can credibly say to that client or potential future clients, I've done that kind of a deal. I've overseen the people that handle those types of things. Here's what the process is. We would be good. We would be the right people in the U.S. to represent you on this matter, because we already know some of the issues, and we've got relationships with the people in the local jurisdiction to get this deal done. And third, related to what I just said, not only do you gain the substantive knowledge, but you gain the broader network. You start to get more relationships with people. You start to deepen those relationships with, additional service providers, with your main points of contact, to bring them additional work. And, that as a practitioner in the US, that just, increases your profile and help builds, as I said, builds your network. So I think for those three reasons, it's very helpful to have someone based in the US that is overseeing the process. But I think that's a great point that you raised.
So going back to talking about the mayor in quotes, and not that we would ever have anything like this in the U.S., but,
right.
Sometimes in foreign jurisdictions, to get things done, we sometimes call them grease payments. We sometimes call them facilitation payments.
Right.
Yes. That's the nice technical term for it. But
that's a lot of syllables, so it sounds important.
That's right. But, look, the reality of it is that, you may be in a jurisdiction where maybe things get done through side payments and you're not going to get your cargo through. You're not going to get your permit. You're not going to get police protection, whatever it is. And it may be a situation where it's a country in which people are not making a living wage. And it's just that's how that person, quite frankly, is expected to get compensated. And so It's completely different. I say completely, we hope, is a completely different system that we have here in the U.S. But, it is, to do business there, you may have to do it. And then you get into, potentially running afoul of U.S. law. And, there's at least, some talk of increased enforcement of corruption. We've seen the White House has laid out a pretty extensive document recently about, strategy to, combat corruption. And it looks like there's going to be a lot of movements towards doing more of those FCPA cases. So how do you kind of deal with these issues especially when you're trying to manage something afar to make sure that's not happening? And if you have, maybe a situation where on a no names basis, there has happened, how have you thought through and dealt with that?
Yeah, no, great point. And maybe this is the crux of, our conversation today. To go to the first part of the question, look, this is where, and I think Phil might have made reference to this earlier. In my experience, usually the way that this sort of occurs is through less than justifiable service contract or service agreements or the sort of nebulous consulting arrangements where it's really questionable as to what exactly are the services being rendered and is the compensation appropriate for those services. That's sort of like, to the extent that there is documentation in this sort of, corruption area, if you will, that's where I've seen it most likely to crop up. In those, as I said, nebulous service agreements where, it's really not, quite so apparent on the face of the agreement as to what those services are for and how the valuation was arrived at. And in particular, in the real estate world, I can tell you that this often is in the area of like commission payments for brokers. That tends to be an area that's rife with, potential corruption and where, because it has the potential appearance of being legitimate because it's really hard to drill down on, was that broker, quote unquote, really critical for identifying the piece of property? Would, you not be in a position to make the acquisition or participate in the transaction, but for that, broker's efforts? How exactly did that broker become aware of the opportunity? What additional relationships exist between the broker and the, seller of the property or the owner of the property, et cetera. So at least from my perspective in the real estate world, that's where a lot of the questionable characters and payments tend to be. Now that's a bit of a distinction from the point that I think you were raising, which is an absolutely valid one, and particularly in some jurisdictions. And this has been my experience in some Middle Eastern countries. I mean, not to besmirch an entire geography, I can tell the listeners that my family comes from Lebanon, and so I'm intimately familiar with some of the practices at least in that country. And the sort of scenario that you were outlining, Matthew, there is less what I was talking about and more of like with respect to sort of representatives of the government, whether it's officers at the port. Whether it's regulators, business regulators that are making sure that you've paid your business registration fee for the year, those types of individuals, as opposed to like private individuals. And there, look, it's I don't want to sound trite. It's a really challenging and complicated situation because I think you've presented it in a very sort of sophisticated way and a very realistic way, frankly, that in a lot of these situations, it is, as a matter of course, how business gets done. That, these are individuals who don't really make a living wage in a lot of these countries, from personal experience, the sort of apparatus of the, state actors, is lacking. And these individuals have, families to feed. And the way that they do that is by getting these, additional facilitation payments. So I would say, and I don't know if this would necessarily pass muster under the FCPA, and certainly in terms of any sort of heightened scrutiny or enforcement, as you outlined, looks probable for the future. But to the extent that you or your client is making any, in my mind, is making any payment that is out of the norm, that is above, materially different from what any other party in that situation would have to do to facilitate that transaction. That is where I think the danger zone lies, because to the extent that you are simply making a payment to a representative of the government, quote unquote, some sort of official in their official capacity, that is a standard payment that any other individual in that situation would have to make. I don't view that as a bribe or an illegal payment that is trying to advance your interests at the expense of other parties. And if it is if the guy at the port tells you that in order to get that piece of cargo, to get that stamp on that piece of cargo to allow it to go through to the factory, you have to make a payment of X. That seems to be the normal course of business in order to work in that jurisdiction. And if you're just making the payment that anyone else would have to make, I don't see that as corruptly influencing a local individual. Frankly, it's more of like a fee that's being imposed in order to get your transaction done. So perhaps that's just a distinction in my mind and wouldn't really be respected by the appropriate authorities. But otherwise, you can be stuck in a situation, Matthew, where you're just unable to accomplish anything. And that doesn't seem like, the right outcome.
Well, this, I think, is actually a great difference in laws distinction moment where, you can draw a line between, say, the US FCPA, which I think permits in many circumstances, and this is not giving legal advice, but if you Google it and look it up, so not real legal advice, you can see that the FCPA does not prohibit things like facilitation payments or you got to pay to get the cargo off the ship in port kind of payments. But there are other globally enforced anti-corruption laws that do prohibit facilitation payments. So, right. They're depending on where you're practicing, where the cargo's from, where the cargo's going, and who all is involved. There are different considerations in place, which I think it sort of segues to something else that I wanted to ask about, Assaad, or chat about a little bit. And that's, taking a step back. The world is a smaller place. You can sit in an office in New York and build a large construction project in Asia fairly easily. Although I imagine it involves staying up late some nights and getting up real early some mornings. But this is a thing that happens all the time. So on its face, it seems like things have gotten a lot easier when it comes to doing, working on deals all over the world. But, is that really the case? Have things gotten easier, or are things moving more quickly, but in a way that's more complicated and frustrating?
I'm going to give you a real lawyer answer here. Yes and no, and it depends. No, look, without being flip, you're absolutely right, Phil. The technological advances, especially in the last few years, and really, certainly they've been exacerbated by, pandemic and lockdown and the need for business to continue, notwithstanding the fact that, for a few months, people weren't even allowed to leave their homes in a lot of jurisdictions. Don't
tell Matthew, because COVID doesn't exist in North Texas.
He's just baiting me. I'm not falling for it.
I was hoping, we've got some mutual friends.
I believe it's the entire state of Texas, just to be clear,
right.
But,
Yeah, that's true. It applies all counties. But, it's the ease with which, and to the point that you were getting at, Phil, the ease with which, communications can occur these days. You have the entire world at your, in the pocket of your, in your pocket right now with our, smartphones, mobile devices, et cetera. So, from that perspective, it has absolutely gotten easier in order to, reach out to people in jurisdictions to find that local assistance that we were talking about, to facilitate your communications with regulators that will be reviewing your transaction, to communicate with business people, whether at your client or on the other side of the deal. Absolutely. All of those things are much easier than they were in the past. And frankly, I could not have done my job working with that real estate development company based in Hong Kong and Tokyo, even though I was living in New York, without those, the benefit of that technology. So from that perspective, certainly things have gotten easier from, for doing global deals. And frankly, I think people are more willing to entertain those kind of, I think US-based investors are more willing to entertain those kind of transactions because they can occur through the use of that technology without having to jump on a plane and be, if you could even get into the country, be, on the ground in Asia for weeks at a time. So yes, from that perspective, absolutely. On the other hand, as you were alluding to, it has also gotten far more complicated, and for a few reasons. I think that we're in a situation where, for lack of a better expression, each person is trying to get theirs. And so that includes not only, business people directly involved in a transaction, but also, regulators and governmental authorities. And, to the extent that they have beefed up their regulatory regimes and the imposition of additional fees and expenses in order to approve transactions to go forward, and this ranges from at the national level, at the local level. There's a lot of players that are involved now because, obviously it can be good business. You can create a whole apparatus. And, I think, you guys know better than I, but we probably even see this to some extent in the United States as well. It's good for, the government to be able to employ more people. And in order to do that, you need to charge more for those governmental services. So I think there is more intervention from various, public actors in certain jurisdictions. Every level, it seems to be like new levels of bureaucracy every year, new applications that need to be filed for different kinds of transactions. That makes the process more cumbersome. That slows things down. That adds expense. Certainly for anyone thinking about doing a deal in those jurisdictions. Putting aside that, maybe I'm being a little too harsh or cynical, there are also sort of legitimate new regulations that have been imposed in a number of jurisdictions that make these kind of deals more complicated. I think an obvious one there is from a data privacy perspective. Obviously GDPR has resulted in significantly increased costs, efforts for parties that process and deal with data across jurisdictions. Other jurisdictions that aren't necessarily part of GDPR, I think, have looked at that regime as one to emulate. And have looked to, adopt maybe not a fulsome, GDPR process, but elements of that. If you're dealing with multiple jurisdictions, even if they're in the same region, to the extent that they have different regulatory regimes from a data privacy perspective or otherwise, that really complicates your potential transaction. And so, going back to my original response, it depends, and it is both, easier and more challenging to accomplish these transactions in this current climate.
Well, with even those challenges in mind, in this year-end holiday season, whatnot, I'd like to sort of close with asking, what has you optimistic about working on these kinds of deals going forward, in the year ahead? What's gotten better and what's coming up that you're excited about?
Sure.
By the way, did you see the pain there? He was like being optimistic. You could actually just see it on his face when he was asking the question. It's just so hard.
Yeah, don't watch this in slow motion because you'll see like ticks and cracks and
that frame by frame analysis of like the exact moment when your heart breaks as you say those words. Yeah,
exactly.
No, it's a great question. Look, I think that there is a lot of froth out there to get deals done right now. I think that the pandemic, will certainly have a chilling effect on, some transactions getting done. I think especially from like a cross-border perspective, just because, notwithstanding everything we said earlier about, the ease of technology facilitating, communications, due diligence has been harder to accomplish when you can't be on the ground yourself, and having to entirely rely on others, especially if you're talking about really material transactions. That adds an element of risk that not every client is comfortable with. So as that, maybe this is wishful thinking, especially given what's going on in the last week and a half, as the restrictions on travel diminish, hopefully in the near future, and the ability to travel, perform diligence, yourselves or with, trusted advisors that you really know well in other jurisdictions, as that exacerbates, I think there's going to be more of an appetite to do these kind of transactions. And frankly, I think that there's a lot of people feel like there's a lot of good deals out there right now. There's been maybe not quite a correction in the, stock market sense of the term, but there have been changes to valuations that have occurred based on macroeconomic factors in the last 2 years. And certain industries, targets have been hurt, more significantly than others. And so there's a potential for, good acquisitions out there. And to the extent that inflationary pressures are making certain kinds of investments less appealing in the U.S., people are going to be looking to deploy their capital, which has, been built up significantly in the last 2 years, on good, good deals. And I think that those can often exist in other jurisdictions. And so those are the reasons why I'm optimistic that, despite the challenges that, we have encountered and are still in the midst of, there is the potential for significant activity in the year to come.
Well, I think that's a great sort of high note to leave on. Assaad, thanks for joining us today. This has been great. Listeners, as always, you can subscribe to Sidebar from the Bracewell webpage or anywhere else you get your podcasts. Thanks very much for listening and stay out of trouble.
Thanks, Assaad.
My pleasure, guys. Thank you.